Dr. Shoo Lee, one of the world's leading neonatologists who has led an independent expert panel, analysed the evidence against Lucy Letby and concluded that she may be innocent and the victim of a horrendous miscarriage of justice.
Just had an astonishing 2 hours, Camilla. We're here at 1 St George's Street in central London, where Dr. Shoo Lee, the MP David Davis, and a number of other medical experts have laid out over 120 minutes. Camilla, I think both of us agree that we have just sat through two of the most remarkable hours in either of our careers. A panel of experts who are now saying that none of the convictions against Lucy Letby are safe. We'll be joined by David Davis, who led the press conference today, the MP who has led the campaign for justice for Lucy Letby, and Sarah Knapton, our science editor, who has also been one of the journalists to first start questioning the evidence against who was once described and is still described as one of Britain's most horrific serial killers. Camilla, there's still the hubbub of noise here, still interviews taking place. It's been a really remarkable day that we have experienced, and a really important day probably in British justice. But before we kick off with the interviews, with some of our analysis, let's just hear Dr. Shoo Lee's. This was at the end of his evidence when he went through the summation of why he believes that none of the convictions against Lucy Letby are safe.
We found that the medical histories were incomplete. It was a failure to consider the obstetric history. There was disregard for surveillance warnings about bacterial colonization. There was misdiagnosis of diseases in these babies. They were caring for babies that were probably beyond their expected ability or designated level of care. There were unsafe delays in diagnosis and treatment of acutely ill patients. There were poor skills at resuscitation and intubation. There was poor supervision of junior doctors in procedures like intubation. There were poor skills in basic medical procedures like insertion of chest tubes. There was lack of understanding about basic things like respiratory physiology and how to mechanically ventilate a baby. There was poor management of common neonatal conditions like hypoglycemia. There was lack of knowledge about commonly used equipment in the NICU like Neopath and capnograph. There was failure to protect infants who were at risk, for example hemophilia, from trauma during intubation. There was a lack of teamwork and trust between the health professions. There were also statements given by many witnesses which point to serious resource and infrastructure deficiencies. And these specific concerns that were expressed by individuals include inadequate numbers of appropriately trained personnel in the unit, lack of training for assigned nursing roles, inadequate staffing and workload overload, poor plumbing and drainage resulting in the need for intensive cleaning in the unit. And this is a potential factor in Stenotrophomonas multifida infection because this particular bacteria thrives in water, and particularly in dirty water and bad water. There was poor environmental temperature control in the facility. There was difficulty in finding a doctor when the need arose. There was congestion at the medication cabinet and preparation trolley. There was lack of appropriate facilities for sterile preparation of drugs. Some high-risk infants should have been born and cared for at higher-level institutions, but were born and cared for in this hospital. And there were delays in transfer of sick infants to higher level facilities when the need arose.
Look, Kamal, we have got a very, very lengthy summary of the report that's been put together by the independent expert panel. It's hugely detailed, it's extremely medical, it's quite complicated from a scientific perspective. Just to break it down and to remind ourselves, Lucy Letby was convicted of killing and attempting to kill altogether 17 babies using different methods. The methods that she was accused of using included injecting air into their intubation tubes, therefore causing them to suffer from air embolism, purposefully trying to block tubes, to try and dislodge tubes, and basically interfering with feeding and indeed intubation tubes. She was also accused of infecting feeding bags with insulin that would then cause babies to suffer and die. She was accused of causing trauma to a baby's abdomen and causing them to suffer liver damage. And she was also accused in one case of overfeeding babies. So it was a whole catalogue of accusations against her. Manchester Crown Court held a very lengthy trial, listening to evidence that was put to the jury. It cited statistical evidence suggesting that she had been present in the cases of all of the deaths. It cited medical evidence from an expert for the prosecution called Dr. Dowie Evans, basically suggesting that there was no other way that these babies could have died than in Lucy Letby's care, and that she had not just been negligent in her behaviour, but beyond reasonable doubt had either killed them or attempted to kill them. What we've had with this, and I don't know about you, I've covered quite a lot of press conferences like this. I sort of thought I'd come this morning and maybe hear a rather circumspect, well, we've had a look at the evidence. In some cases we've concluded this, but in others we've concluded that. I've never known such a sort of systematic demolition of a prosecution case in my entire life. Have you?
I've never seen it done in this way, and done, as you say, so definitely. Dr. Shoo Lee, as you say, one of the leading neonatalist experts in the world, he went through and said, for example, and we've got our notes here right in front of us, we were scribbling away through these 2 hours of this press conference. He just said, on the idea of air embolism, injecting air into veins or arteries, let us do away with that theory. They went through, and we've got to remember the families here. These are dead children. And he went through each of the baby cases and put forward exact reasons why those children could have died, because they were either very, very seriously ill or the medical care was not good enough. And in each and every case, he said the allegations made against Lucy Letby all had other explanations.
And it's worth remembering that Dr. Shoo Lee became involved in this because the prosecution expert witness, Dr. Evans, relied on a paper that he had written about air embolism. And Dr. Evans has suggested that in some of the cases, the babies, their skin appeared discoloured or mottled, and that this automatically meant that they must have suffered from an air embolism. And Dr. Lee came forward to say, no, you've misinterpreted my paper. That's not what we've said at all. So the kind of first shock moment was this idea that air embolism is linked to skin discoloration, which was effectively the key plank of the prosecution's case.
And what was remarkable, Camilla, with that, I think this 2 hours, I found out so much about how justice doesn't work. The fact that the prosecution solicitors never got in touch with Dr. Shoo Lee, even though they were using his evidence from 1989, so a long time ago. They didn't get in touch with him to ask him what his opinion was of this case in the UK. He is in Canada, and he was only vaguely aware and saw it in a press clipping that they had used his own paper, and that's why he became interested in it. So one of the key lessons must be that a prosecution must get in touch with the expert they're going to be quoting to try and convict somebody.
So we've got that question now being posed about the way that trials involving complex medical information are handled. We've also, I think, now got very serious question marks over the Countess of Chester Hospital and whether this may be another maternity scandal. Dr. Lee was asked a very straight question by a private eye journalist called Philip Hammond about whether this would happen in his own native country of Canada. This is what he said.
I would say that if this hospital, we also have a level 1, 2, 3 standard in our hospital, similar to the UK. We are, after all, a British colony previously, and a lot of our systems, were built on the British standards. I would say that if this was a hospital in Canada, it would be shut down. It wouldn't be happening.
Dr. Shoo Lee was just so straightforward, wasn't he, in how he answered things and how he laid out his evidence. But I think, as you say, this is now turning into a possible medical negligence claim. One of the other claims against Lucy Letby in her trial, which we heard about here, was that she had also turned off alarms. And the evidence that Dr. Shoo Lee said was that there was no evidence that she had turned off alarms, and that nurses had said there was no evidence of that, but the doctors had said there was evidence of that. And there is this interesting issue, which we will pick up with Sarah Knapton a little bit later, about hierarchies within the NHS, about how complaints are properly made and how evidence is gathered.
And people listening and watching this might think to themselves, well, hang on, it wasn't just about the medical evidence, you know. Lucy Letby was found to have scrawled a load of very disturbing messages on notes. It looked as if she was torturing herself. She appeared guilty because she was saying, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have done this. She was obsessing over the cases of the babies.
She said as well, Camilla, didn't she? Am I evil?
Yes.
I think that was a very shocking part of the case, which a lot of the families have said, and they've been sitting through a separate inquiry, the Thirlwell inquiry, which is going on into how this took place at this hospital. And they were saying, we sat through all the evidence and we believe her to be guilty. But one of those shocking moments was these notes being discovered. And the solicitor was asked directly about this. OK, the medical evidence may not stand up. Let's listen to her solicitor, Mark MacDonald, answer the question about the other evidence.
First of all, Lucy Letby was convicted because of the medical evidence that was presented to the jury. Medical evidence led by the lead prosecution expert, Dr. Derry Evans. If that evidence was at fault and was wrong, the conviction is unsafe. It's as simple as that. The other parts of the evidence that you talk about, the circumstantial or the lesser circumstantial evidence, falls away. Now, we can go through each one of those if you want. There is a valid explanation for all of them. But the most important thing, the reason why Lucy Letby was convicted was because of the evidence, the medical evidence that was presented to the jury. That today has been demolished.
Also, Mr. MacDonald addressed the issue of how Lucy Letby is feeling currently in prison. Again, we've talked about the trauma that has faced the families now for years. In light of what we've heard today, we do have to think about Lucy Letby in a different light, I think, and reflect on the fact that she is possibly in prison for a crime and crimes that she has not committed. And this is what he said about how his client was doing.
You know, what I have done since I've instructed is not talk about Lucy and not talk about where she is and what she's doing. I've focused upon the issues in relation to an unsafe conviction. But she has hope, and that's all I can say.
It was interesting to me that this has all been presented as what is the evidence. They didn't talk about Lucy Letby really at all. They just went through the evidence, and I think it is a deliberate and probably quite reasonable move to try and depersonalize this from the evil Lucy Letby, to make this into an emotionless running through the evidence. Dr. Shoo Lee, I don't think, mentioned Lucy Letby once. I think this expert panel are not only saying that she is not guilty of the crime she has been convicted of, but that there were no crimes, and that the explanations are actually to do with poor care and very sick, often prematurely born babies.
Sarah Knapton, the Telegraph science editor, joins us now. You have done so much coverage of this already. I wasn't expecting this press conference to unfold quite as it has. What's your reaction to what you've heard today?
It's been quite astonishing, actually. I don't think we expected the neonatologists who are on this review panel to be quite as experienced as they are. I mean, we've got some real big names there. So you've got Nina Modi, who is the former president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. Big name. She's at Imperial College now. You've got experts from all over the world, from Harvard, from Canada, from New Zealand. You know, these are big names who've all come together to basically show or, you know, review this evidence and suggest that there were no murders in this case, that all of these babies basically died from either natural causes, you know, congenital problems that they had, or from poor care in the hospital. And I thought a very striking part of Dr. Lee's testimony today was when he said that if this had been a hospital in Canada, it would have been shut down. It was that bad.
Sarah, you came onto the podcast with Martin Evans, our crime editor, some months ago when you first did the first investigation, one of the first investigations in the UK into the problems with the evidence. Did you think, Sarah, when you wrote that very detailed story questioning the evidence against Lucy Letby, that we would end up here with such definitive evidence that, as Dr. Shoo Lee said, there were no murders?
I would say no. I mean, usually in cases like this, it takes years and years and years to get to this point. I think because it tends to be a dribble effect of people getting on board. This has been, like a boulder that's just taken, got momentum and has been going and going. And, these days, every paper you open, there's new evidence in the case, and lots of people are interested in it. I think the very fact that you've got so many people looking into it now, as opposed to when I was looking into it, is just, it's phenomenal, really. And, at the time, I was really struggling to get people to talk to me. No one wanted to be the expert that was going to stand up for the baby killer. I was frightened to put my head above the parapet, to be honest. And I got a lot of abuse and still get a lot of abuse online for doing it. And so when you get press conferences like this, where suddenly you've got 14 of the world's best neonatologists that are kind of on your side almost, it's good. It's good for the Telegraph to have been sort of at the front of that and really leading the way in trying to show that this had huge problems from the word go.
It strikes me that we've heard sort of three things today. First of all, that some of the babies unfortunately were very, very critically ill and died from natural causes. Second of all, huge concerns that have been raised, as you mentioned earlier, about the Countess of Chester Hospital. But also this third element, and I wondered if you can comment on it from a sort of scientific point of view, Sarah, this idea that the handling of medical evidence in cases like these in court is very difficult, that it's difficult when we've had a lot of criticism of Dowie Evans, the prosecution expert witness in this case. He isn't here right now to defend himself, but it was clearly very difficult for the jury to properly analyse the evidence, and there is a mystery over why the defence team didn't call their own expert witnesses to contradict the evidence that we heard in court. What's your view on that?
I think on the defence point, I've talked to their defence I've talked to their defence expert, and I don't think he was as unequivocal as Dowie Evans was in his evidence, and so they were reluctant to call him, I suspect, in case it added almost more confusion to the proceedings. But at the same time, it's a mystery as to why they didn't call better experts, because I've talked to experts who said they got in touch with the defence team, offered their services, and they never got back to them.
Can I just ask you about the Thirlwell inquiry, which is going on into the Countess of Chester Hospital, predicated on the supposed fact that Lucy Letby is guilty of murder? You've been covering that inquiry as well. Is there any point to that inquiry anymore?
I mean, from the word go, it was the huge elephant in the room of that inquiry that there was still a question over whether Letby did this to begin with. So you've essentially got an inquiry that's trying to ascertain why something that may not have happened, how you could prevent that, which is crackers, really, isn't it? And if I was Lady Thirlwell now, I'd be thinking, I need to pause this and wait to see what CCRC thinks, because at the moment, effectively you allowed doctors who essentially had a motive for Lucy to be guilty to get on another stand, this time at the Thirlwell inquiry, and say, really without challenge, because Letby's team weren't allowed to be there, whatever they liked. And it wasn't fair in many ways, given that the appeal process had finished at that point, but we did know that there was plans to go to the CCRC. We knew it wasn't finished, and that there was a new barrister instructed, and so for it to have carried on, I'm amazed that it's carried on for so long.
Also, for the parents of the children, it's so difficult, isn't it, to sit here and go through this press conference and even try and begin to imagine the agony for them. On one hand, we know why David Davis pursued this from the beginning. He said the parents have to know what really happened. But what do you anticipate the reaction to this is going to be, Sarah?
I mean, like you say, it's devastating for the families. They've been going through this now since 2015, so we're talking 10 years for some of them who were the early deaths. And arguably you could say they still don't know what happened to their babies. If Shoo Lee's right, then it could be a whole host of other reasons that we haven't examined properly yet. We've got this team of neonatologists, but it still needs to be possibly re-examined in court. So, I mean, I suppose they will be listening to this. I don't know if they are kind of stepping back from it. I mean, they've had to relive it all through the Thirlwell inquiry this year as well, so it's just adding yet more trauma. Some of the tales that the families gave at the Thirlwell inquiry were horrific. A lot of the families won't let their children be examined by doctors anymore because they're so scared of the medical system and what happened to them. And I'm hearing that from nurses. I'm hearing nurses I've heard from nurses that they're not allowed to be with babies on their own anymore. Parents don't like it since this case. And so it's having a much wider impact than simply the trial. And you've got this. It feels like it's affecting a whole host of people from the NHS to the families to the courts. There's a whole issue about the courts. So but I do feel for the families today, and no one wants this to be raked up again.
I was struck, Sarah, in some of the evidence that was put forward by Dr. Shoo Lee, that often the nurses raise things that the doctors had either missed or ignored. And again, that seems to go to the heart of a fundamental problem within the NHS about hierarchy and listening to all people who have an opinion that is relevant.
I think that was the case, and I think it came across from the very start. The doctors were believed more than the nurses, even though the nurses supported Letby throughout this. But I think, there was... Clearly there were problems in that hospital. The doctors were only making 2 rounds a week, so they didn't really know what was going on with the babies. And the nurses arguably had more idea of what was happening there, and so should have been listened to more. I think that's a fair point.
Sarah, we better let you go back to the office and write this up, and we look forward to reading your coverage. Thank you very much.
Coming up next, the politician who has led the campaign for justice for Lucy Letby, David Davis.
David Davis, we've just been listening to this extraordinary 2-hour press conference. Yeah. I don't think I've ever been at an event that has so cleanly driven a coach and horses through a prosecution case. Is this one of the biggest miscarriages of justice you've ever witnessed?
Well, I think it is in terms of consequences for the victim, which is Lucy Letby in this context, because basically it's the rest of her life, 14, 15 times over. What you've seen today has been some of the most expert people in the world in neonatology and the various other skills involved in analysing this, going through the case notes that were available to the experts in the original case. And plainly, they didn't go through them carefully enough. So now we have the highest authority possible. I am hoping, bear in mind, I've never said Lucy should be instantly exonerated. I'm saying she should be retried with real high-class experts. We've now identified them all for you worldwide, and a proper, complete review of the case. And if they do that, I think it's highly likely that they will exonerate her.
Chester Hospital has now become the centre of this discussion, as well as the trial itself. What should be happening there for people who are concerned about the evidence you have revealed today about the lack of treatment for babies who are very sick? Because the justice system, the wheels grind very slowly. It could be years before Lucy Letby gets to a position of getting her appeal heard. Countess of Chester Hospital is still continuing despite the evidence that you've laid out today.
Well, it's not continuing dealing with babies as fragile as this. I mean, the day that Lucy was suspended, they downgraded the hospital. That was one of the ironies in this. They knew they couldn't cope, and they should have. They probably had the back of their minds that some of this was down to that. So that's not quite the risk. But there are three problems other than the miscarriage of justice here. Two problems with the justice system: how they handle experts, how they handle would-be appeals. I think neither of them deliver justice. But also there is a really serious problem with how the health service deals with its own mistakes or systemic series of mistakes, as appears to be the case here. And we know historically they're terrible with whistleblowers. If you're a whistleblower in the health service, say goodbye to your career. I've had 4 nurses say they wanted to give evidence on behalf of Lucy, but they were told by their supervisors, their managers, it would not be good for them, and so they didn't. Now, we have to learn a better way of correcting the health service. I mean, 1 million people or so a year go through, more than that. We all know of mistakes. Now, okay, doctors are human; they make mistakes. But if you're an airline pilot and you make a mistake, you put the wheels down rather than the flaps or whatever. They look at what you did. They look at your training. They look at the design of the aircraft. They look at every aspect of it and stop it happening fatally, or try to. When there is a fatal accident, they go through it with a fine tooth comb to find anything that we could put right. If we do that for the airlines, then why shouldn't we really be doing that with the health service? And that's a really, really big outcome of this. If we succeed in this, it's the next step, one of the next steps on the process of reform.
Talking of next steps, what does happen next? Because she's had 2 appeals refused now.
Yeah.
Where do you go from here?
Historically, 2 things to say. Historically, some of the great miscarriages of justice, and bear in mind there have been about 500 since the 70s that we know about, the ones that have been overruled. Some of the great miscarriages of justice have often gone through 2 or 3 attempts to get through appeal, and eventually an appeal judge says, well, I know our rules say this, but actually it's plainly a miscarriage. That's happened a couple of times. So the judicial rules don't deliver justice, right? So that's the first thing. Her defence lawyer, Mark MacDonald, has put in the CCRC application. That's the Criminal Case Review Commission. These are the people who basically review cases like this. Now, they can be quite slow. There's a fairly famously recently the Andrew Malkinson case, who was in prison for 17 years, even though there was clear DNA evidence exonerating him 4 years after the case. So we can't have that. To be blunt, Lucy's in her 30s. She said in one of those notes, that was infamous notes, she wanted to get married and have children, and that wouldn't happen. I don't want this to last over a decade. This is number 13 miscarriage for me. Most of them have lasted over a decade. The post office lasts over a decade. The Mulligan Tyler, so many of them lasted over a decade. That can't happen here. It's got to be quicker than that. And that's why I'm doing it publicly. That's why I'm trying to get people to say, actually, we need a resolution of this. There's plainly something wrong here, as anybody who is here today would understand.
Camilla, you and I have already, in the relatively short life of the Daily Tea podcast, we've been going since last May, we have dealt with 4 or 5 huge negligent stories around health and people mistreated in the health service and no admission of guilt, etc., etc. David, you mentioned Harold Shipman. 25 years ago, the convicted mass killer, the GP. After that, everyone said we must have a no-fault system, just the one you've described around that works in the airline industry. How confident can we be that anything will change? We keep going round the same houses, making the same points. What is it about the NHS that doesn't understand over decades the need for change?
Well, we're too much in awe of it for 2 reasons. Firstly, we put our doctors on a pedestal. We sort of have to for our confidence in them, really, and that's part of the problem. And also, we go out and applaud the NHS during pandemics and this sort of thing. We've got to recognise it's a fallible organisation. It frankly is no longer the best in the world. When I grew up, when I was a child, I thought the NHS was the best in the world. I don't think it's true anymore. You look at the death rates. You look at any measure of it, frankly. And now the current government, not my government, but the current government, are talking about reform. And at some point, I'm going to talk to Wes Streeting, and we've agreed to meet, that reform should be about outcomes. It's not just about money. The Treasury will try and drive it to be about money. It's about outcomes, and we know that in the 2 years before the pandemic, we increased the amount of money going to health service by quite a lot, and actually its outputs went down. It saved fewer lives, you know. We've got to face that fact. And I think this will be a part of it. The learning process is non-existent, right? It's not quite true. There's some learning, you know, the medical schools and so on look at what's going on and try and improve on it, but it's far, far too slow and far, far too clunky and far, far too defensive, which is why we come back to the airline approach to it. Because, you know, the airline pilot who says, I pressed the wrong button, doesn't get fired for it, you know. They go through and do the analysis I described. That's what should happen in the health service. I made a mistake. We must stop it happening again.
David Davis, thank you so much for your time once again on the Daily Tea. One doesn't want to get lofty at a time like this because actually we need to reflect on how these families are going to be feeling about this. But it does reiterate the value of good journalism. To be fair to her, Sarah Knapton has been looking at this with a gimlet eye. She's looked at it completely objectively. At times she's doubted herself. You know, she's written stories saying, some of this evidence literally doesn't seem to stack up. She's got a load of abuse for it. We know there's been criticism of the people who have raised questions. You could raise questions, and I think we found this with David Davis. We said to David Davis, look, what if you discover that you think she's guilty? Yeah, well, she's guilty. What struck me about today is none of these people have a vested interest. It doesn't serve their purposes to say, look, there were no murders. In fact, it opens them to professional ridicule.
Absolutely, and I think the fact that Sarah Knapton is our science editor, you know, she follows the evidence. You know, she has scientific expertise, I think, is so vital that it is a dispassionate look at this case. Because as you say, if you think of the family and they believe that in some way they have closure because the guilty person has been found, how horrific, piled upon the horrors they're already facing, to now be told maybe you don't know the truth, or the death of your child could have been preventable, or there is clinical negligence that the NHS have allowed to happen and then allowed the wrong person to go forward as the only person that is guilty of any wrongdoing. All those things are now playing in your head as a parent. And so you do need the journalism of people like Sarah and others, and David Davis referred to the New Yorker report that was done when we were all still sub judice because of the eighth case of attempted murder against Lucy Letby. That is why what we do really matters.
Also, just in terms of justice delayed is justice denied, it struck me there, Sarah talking about how long now is this all going to take? How long is this agony going to be prolonged for? Slightly scary to reflect on David Davis making the point about Malkinson having to wait for 17 years in prison, even though 4 years into his sentence, DNA evidence emerged to suggest he was innocent. I don't know, do we think that that spotlight of disinfectant, that kind of very public press conference we've just witnessed, all of us being here, we've had a load of other big names here, Paul Brand of ITV, BBC's covering it, people like John Sweeney who's looked into it in depth, columnists like Peter Hitchens, you know, there's some heavyweight journalists here. Does that make a difference? Does that speed any of this up? What if they turn around and say, well, sorry, you had the chance at the defence to present all this evidence and you didn't?
I'm so institutionally sceptical. I look back to Harold Shipman. I look back to the specials we have done on the infected blood inquiry. I look back to all the maternity ward controversies there have been where babies have died because of bad care. I look back to Harold Shipman 25 years ago, never again. We must change. The NHS has such deep institutional defensiveness and such deep hierarchical attitudes. I do worry that it will not learn the lessons. And I think this will, you know, David Davis, we had a little chat to David Davis after we'd spoken to him, and he mentioned Wes Streeting and he's going to meet Wes Streeting, the health secretary. But it is surely, this has to land on Wes Streeting's desk, and he has to say, no fault systems used in the airline industry must be now used, the duty of candour in the NHS at all times. But Camilla, As I said, in our short life on the Daily Tea podcast working together, we have dealt with, 6 or 7 of these. We did 2 specials on Lucy Letby ourselves. You led on one of them with Gordon Rayner and David Davis. We'll link to those in the show notes, because I think it's well worth saying that with Sarah Knapton, Martin Evans, but also, you led on a lot of work on this case. Just keep reading the evidence, and let's hope that you, our audience, and the public can keep the pressure on actually Wed Streeting and the leaders of the NHS to make the changes that this does not happen again. But as I say, I'm always sceptical. I've been in this job for 35 years. And we've been covering cases like this for 35 years, and we're still doing it.
And also the Prime Minister. I mean, you would have thought, as a former Director of Public Prosecutions, that Keir Starmer, as a former lawyer, will take a keen interest in this, because he is a man who's interested in weighing up evidence and the evidence to bring people to trial. And then as a prosecutor, he wants to be able to say that he's brought people to trial fairly and that they've been fairly heard in court and that they are convicted because they are guilty. So I think I can't imagine a scenario where he isn't going to keep a keen eye on this. I know not necessarily to be directly involved, but don't tell me that our lawyerly Prime Minister isn't going to be reflecting on this today. I know he's got a lot on his plate, but I just think it's been a startling morning, really. It's been much more monumental than I thought it would be.
Today, the Lucy Letby case went from a case about a possible grotesque miscarriage of justice to an issue that does go right to the Prime Minister and the need for change.